First of all, I can't believe I have to follow Jay and Neil, the two hardest working men in adult education, I swear to God. Last week, I think, at the non-credit conference, I actually referred to Neil as the James Brown of adult education. And he does sort of dance when he presents. That's what I kind of noticed today. So I am actually, the presentation I'm going to give is going to be sort of metric light. I'm not going to talk a lot about the metrics because Jay and Neil did a superb job of covering those in their presentation, summarizing an 8-hour training in 1 hour. It's very impressive. I am going to talk about the story behind the field team process during the summer. Sort of the folks who came together to kind of define both the data and accountability metrics, the clear kind of definitions of the AEBG program areas, as well as making some decisions regarding processes for data and accountability reporting downstream. And then I will also talk about sort of the progress in a lot of the things that we identify in the report. So I'm going to talk about basically 4 things. First, the background of the Data and Accountability Committee process. I'll talk a little bit about the ledge report and the metrics, just more some of the thought processes that really kind of sit behind the metrics, how we kind of ended up in certain kinds of places. I'm not going to show a bunch of slides that sort of have the metrics listed, but I will talk about kind of what some of the rationale was. I'll talk about the recommendations related to the data and reporting systems for the state and how that's going to roll out and how that's going to be available to consortia to inform not just your ongoing improvement processes, but also your 3-year plans, which will be due in July. And then I'm going to have another add-on about the alignment of assessment, the CB21 NRS crosswalk, which in fact has already started. And I just want to say that there's a lot of recommendations in the report that we submitted in early August to the legislature, and really on every single recommendation with a timeline attached to it, we are absolutely on schedule for delivery of those items by next year for reporting. So it's really astounding that people can really get in gear and move. And I will say that watching the committee's work over the summer was very inspiring. I have been running meetings and managing projects for as long as I can remember, and this is a group of people, your peers, who came together and worked extremely hard. So the background piece. So it was very important to us when we were asked to take on convening these field teams that we really kind of start with the originating documents. And so we tried to go back to where's the source legislation, where's the source guidance, what's the related guidance out there to inform all of our decision-making processes. Here are the 4 kind of key requirements under AB 104 related to data and accountability. To identify the common measures for determining the effectiveness of members of consortia in meeting the educational needs of adults, align data used for reporting and data with data reported by local agencies for other purposes such as WIOA, and we extended that to also look at Perkins and strong workforce, establish common assessments and policies regarding placement of adults into adult education programs, measuring the needs of adults and the effectiveness of providers, and then we get to, it's the program so nice, we have to report on it twice. We have to do a preliminary report that's due to the legislature on October 30th of every year, and then an end-of-year report that's due on March 1st. And I can't think of another new program, and essentially AEBG is a new program that was based upon what previously occurred in adult education, where the reporting requirements are really this intense to the legislature. They really, really want to know what's going on. And so it's fairly intense in terms of what we have to provide. These are the, and I'm just going to say that you're going to see some of the same slides again. I want to thank Neil for previewing my slides for all of you. So here are the measures for effectiveness. How many adults are served by the consortia? How many adults served by the consortia have demonstrated the following? Those are the 6 elements that Jay had in the slide earlier. I will say the differentiation between 1 and 2 is sort of what we use as the basis for differentiating reportable individuals and participants. Reportable individuals being someone who's sort of contacted and has 1 hour of contact, either instruction or student services. The participant being someone who has had 12 hours or more of instructional contact hours. So we basically convened 3 committees. We had the Data and Accountability Committee, we had the CTE Committee, and we had a Basic Skills Assessment Committee. We convened 8 meetings in 8 weeks. They were 5 hours each. It was 40 hours of meetings. We developed a white paper and wrote up comprehensive notes, and those are all published on the AEBG website. In fact, when we had to present in the LAO's office about this work, we actually referred them back to those white papers because they provided a lot of the background and context of sort of what is NRS, what does WIOA actually say, and it was very important to have those papers available to the committees in advance of the sessions so that we were using kind of common texts as the basis for our decision-making processes. This is just kind of the timeline. We had 35 field participants. They were balanced out between K-12 adult school and community college providers and included both for-credit and non-credit community college program representatives. It was important, and this has been said to me many times, people like Madeline have been very eloquent about this, that there are big conversations happening between K-12 adult schools and community colleges. There are also big conversations that have to happen between community college for-credit and non-credit programs. That there's oftentimes a mismatch or different understanding about who the students are in those programs, about how students transition, about how students make progress, and so having all three of those essentially constituency groups in the room was really important to us. We also had leadership from CDE, the Chancellor's Office, CASAS was there, and we actually had a representative from the State Workforce Board on the Data and Accountability Committee, and then a local Workforce Board representative and a representative from the California Federation of Labor in the CTE Committee. So we tried to have some reference to external systems and folks who could also speak to issues related to those systems. Back to this point about sort of trying to be sure we're referring to original text, we really tried to bring as much information into the room as possible and into the white papers prior to each. We actually referenced and referred to the AB 86 and AB 104 legislation, and I will say it's important to refer to both. Because just because AB 104 passed doesn't mean that the AB 86 is not still valid. So AB 86 defines 5 required program areas. AB 104 basically defines 7 allowable uses of funding for programs. So there are slightly different definitions, and AB 104 adds the adults, including but not limited to older adults, participating in training programs to increase child school success, and then the workforce entry reentry program areas. Those are allowable uses of funding, and it was important to understand that what you're really required to do are the 5 programs. So in the Basic Skills Committee, they're talking about the child school success metric, and they're like, well, I've got to create this program. No, you don't necessarily have to create a program there, but it's there and it's allowable, so we're going to capture metrics related to that program to be sure that we're identifying programs where that's happening and what happens to them. We referred to the 2012 LAO report, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, the OCTAE guidelines for college and career readiness, the National Reporting System guidelines, Title IV federal student aid, the Council on Occupational Education, which Neil identified earlier is basically the accrediting body for most of the adult schools in California who are receiving Pell Grant funds to actually fund their CTE programs, and then the class report. Well, as soon as that became available, we incorporated that into the work as well. Title IV federal student aid was actually a very important document for us because we had this epiphany in the CTE process where the CTE providers were like, the K-12 adult school providers were like, we're post-secondary institutions, and a lot of other folks in the room were like, well, what do you mean? Well, we're accredited, and it is true. So the 20 programs that Neil referenced earlier are accredited. They're basically vocational post-secondary institutions under Title IV, of a federal education code, and so they receive Pell Grant funds. So they are post-secondary institutions, which really completely changed the dynamic about how we think about the transition to post-secondary, about how we think about the completion of a post-secondary credential, and it really opened up, I think, additional levels of understanding between the systems about what counts on both sides. And I think it opened up some additional kind of elements of respect from colleges for K-12 when they realize they're also accredited institutions. They have to obey many of the same rules that we do. Hello. So the metrics and the guidance. So we went through 8 weeks of meetings, and so this was the report, the Measuring Our Success report. It basically does a number of different things. So, and I would recommend, and I said this last week at the non-credit conference, if you're going to take 2 documents to your consortia and make them read them, this should be one of them, and the class report should be the other one. That those are the documents that really are trying to sum up what's going on around adult education to really kind of identify a future pathway for adult education. So when people say, like, we don't understand what's going on, this helps set a framework for really how the work is really going to move forward downstream. in the class report in terms of policy recommendations to really kind of build a stronger system. For measuring our success, really the outline of a data and accountability system that allows us to kind of pivot away from data reporting as just some kind of compliance or reporting to the state so we don't get in trouble, to really data and accountability for the purposes of our own evaluation. And I think if you're not having the conversations in your consortia right now about how you're going to use data, the data that comes out in the end of year report for your next 3-year plan, then you're not thinking about the right things, because that is sort of one of the ways in which we're going to be measuring both internally within your consortia, how are we doing, where are we weak, where are we stronger, but also kind of where the system is going. And so really when you build your plans and you decide you're going to go deep on in a certain area for your 3-year plan, look at where are the metrics for that, and then that allows you to begin to think about things like projections for the metrics. So we defined the 7 program areas in AB 104, and following both Neil's comments and Judy's comments, some of these are not programs, some of these are populations. So take, for example, workforce entry, reentry. In the discussion, both in the Data and Accountability Committee and the CTE Committee, folks are like, what is the difference between CTE and workforce entry and reentry? Essentially, they're participating in a workforce development program to get a job. It's probably a CTE program, so how are we going to differentiate those? The decision was made not to differentiate it based on the kind of program it is, understanding that if you think about what reentry could be, it could be previously incarcerated adults, it could be someone who's been out of the workforce for 16 months, it could be someone who's close to exhausting their TANF but hasn't yet found a job, that there's a variety of program models out there that may be in play, but what really defines it is the population you're looking at. And there are very clear WIOA kind of barriers to employment criteria and definitions that you could use to draw that. So the decision was made to pull workforce entry, reentry based on population criteria and not as a distinct program reportable area. Now what that means is when you look at short-term CTE, workforce entry, reentry, and pre-apprenticeship, there's going to be duplication across those 3 if you actually try and add those 3 numbers up, but they're all CTE programs. So probably at the end of your report, what we'll be trying to do is both report on the number of unduplicated students participating in CTE programs and the number of participating in short-term CTE that would actually look like workforce entry, reentry students, and those that are identified as pre-apprenticeship. And pre-apprenticeship as well has very clear Department of Labor definitions, quality indicators, the most important one being having an agreement with a registered apprenticeship program, generally in California under the Division of Apprenticeship Standards at the state, that basically where they have approved the curriculum, they're offering your program for pre-apprenticeship, and that says that when students finish that program, they would be eligible for entry into the apprenticeship program. Sometimes that's called a direct entry agreement, but some kind of MOU or formal agreement is really a key piece of that. And that was a big discussion in the CTE committee, is actually unpacking those and going deeper about how we want to define that. Then we actually went through the data elements, and a lot of these were basically elements that were required by the legislation. But literacy gains, we actually focused on as measurable skills gains and educational functional level attainment for ABE, ASE, and ESL. So we didn't stick just to literacy because it'd be very easy to kind of be much more restrictive. We wanted to include the entire sort of continuum of basic skills. There was a request for definitions that weren't really called for, so beyond the transition to post-secondary, practitioners were very interested to know when people sort of change programs. One of the things we know is that students really bounce around on their journeys. We sort of think it's going to be a highway, they're going to head right down the road, and they're going to elevate and climb into the hills, and it's all great, and actually it's a little bit more like pachinko. Does anyone remember pachinko? So you got the balls, they kind of go up and they kind of bounce around, they move around a little bit, they kind of end up kind of down, in generally a good place. And actually there's been some interesting work where they've taken something like a pachinko and they built a big one and they drop a bunch of balls, the balls tend to cluster. So the effect of student transitions between programs doesn't mean they're not getting there, it just means the route's more indirect, and practitioners want to know a lot more about those journeys. How do students get there? So it's not just, are they getting there quickly, are they getting there, but what does it actually look like, that journey? And it makes you think about transition in a slightly different way. Jay referenced the occupational skills gain and the workforce preparation milestone. That was based on a clear desire to make use of the other measurable skills gains under WIOA. The occupational skills gain metric is very much a kind of exploratory metric. We kind of talked, there are definitely boxes that you can check in TE for that, but in terms of coming to a clearer definition of what those mean, what does it mean to complete a knowledge-based exam in the last one, what does a milestone actually mean? The decision was made to kind of do some exploration this year. That may not show up in the report to the legislature, but it is something that we're going to look at very carefully. Also on the workforce preparation, because workforce preparation certificates and occupational safety certificates are not considered post-secondary credentials for the purposes of reporting that metric, but we know that workforce readiness and workforce preparation may be one of the most important things that we have to learn how to focus on and to measure and to track. To have a way to report that was important to the field and could help stimulate discussions by practitioners about what do we mean. We're saying workforce preparation or workforce readiness, how are you defining that as opposed to how I'm defining it? One of the stunning things to me in sort of looking at the background of this is I looked at things like the New World of Work that Yvonne referenced this morning and other kind of emerging standards, 21st century workforce skills, and then I went back and read the 1992 SCAN standards. They're virtually identical. Does anyone here remember 1992 and SCANs? It was really stunning to me how much foresight there was in those recommendations. And I started to get really mad at my peers because I'm going, New World of Work, New World of Work. And I realized there's nothing new under the sun, that maybe we need to actually identify some standards and just to adhere to them and figure out actually how to teach them. I was at a national conference a couple years ago, and there was an industry association of industry associations making a presentation saying, we have assessed the soft skills required and we have a new list. And I'm in the back of the room, I'm like, I don't really need any more lists. We have lots of lists. What I need is a way to translate this into pedagogy and to teach it and embed it in every CTE course at my college. So I'm starting to rant, and I should not do that. But those kinds of things begin to emerge because that we all have sort of perspectives on the work and how the work gets done, but when you actually go back into and you do some research and you look at the literature, you begin to realize we're actually speaking in many cases the same language and trying to meet the same goals. So I think Neil actually had this slide in his deck, but we had what? Sorry. Oh no. Redundancy is good. Repetition is important. The metrics need to be concrete and clear. We had this initial choice to focus on all adult education students, regardless of funding source. If you go back to AB 86, which is why it's so important, it is crystal clear in AB 86 that the expectation is that we're leveraging apportionment and Perkins and WIOA to build a better adult education system. So we're not just measuring the AEBG funding. It's not the touch by AEBG criteria. It's really looking at how that $500 million incentivizes a new system and builds capacity really across systems. We tried to expand on or default to the WIOA definitions wherever we could, where there was a lot of discussion about the spirit of WIOA in certain cases. We aligned to strong workforce Perkins and other definitions where we could. It was very important not to try and create new reporting systems to just layer on top of other reporting systems, but to try and figure out where we could unify the way people are having to think about their data, both in the collection and the reporting. And that the policies that the committee, this is not sort of, we build a set of recommendations and then we're done. This is really data and accountability, and measuring success is basically an ongoing living, breathing process. And so that the metrics in the report now are followed up by guidance that we wrote that expands on some of the definitions that should change and live and breathe as practitioner questions come forward. I know Neil's working so hard every day because every time he does a training, I get a long list of questions at the end of the night. And there was the time he started live texting me from the middle of a training, and I realized he was waiting for my answer. And there was a room full of people somewhere going like, well, what is it? But that this is ongoing work. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And we've said the same thing about the kind of the CB21 NRS crosswalk, that these are processes, there are new standards that emerge, and we have to constantly kind of be going back and revitalizing them and refining them over time. This is the reportable programs. We covered that. This is basically a recap of the reportable individuals and participant definitions. Someone asked me last week at non-credit, well, why did you decide on 12 hours? And well, 12 hours is the WIOA definition. We basically said under Title II, 12 hours is when they become a participant. We will use the same criteria because that makes us more aligned with the workforce board and other practitioners. WIOA now becoming sort of Lord of the Rings, one ring to rule them all as we move forward. Post-secondary credential completion, and this is, I just included this as an example of the kind of dialogue that we had as we began to realize that K-12 adult schools were also post-secondary institutions, particularly within CTE. So we had to think about ways to define what a credential was. WIOA is both helpful and ambiguous, often at the same time. So they'll have a general definition with a list of these are the kinds of institutions that can provide it, a very long list, and here's some of the kinds of things that could count, but it's not just limited to that. So what it means is we needed to have a discussion about what that meant. So we began to focus on the kinds of things we already have to report, kind of the universe we lived in. It was definitely clear it needed to be clearly occupational. It needed to be able to say, I've done this training, I can get this job. There had to be that relationship, which is why workforce preparation or occupational safety didn't really meet the criteria. And then we're already thinking about completion related to certificates that we offer, related to Perkins, related to the ETPL, related to Title IV, and that it was very important that we kind of identify, we know what this is. And so there were many cases, and I think the child success one was another one where we tried not to over-define it, to kind of set some basic standards, but then not to say, because every time you start to over-define something, you basically exclude someone's program. And we were trying not to do that, but we also had to say, in some cases, just everything doesn't count. So I'm going to talk about the data tools in the system, the processes we're kind of moving forward with. This is one of the bodies of work that I'm very proud of because I think we have something of real value, and that if we actually achieve all of this, we will have something that no other state in the country really has. Which is a longitudinal data system that measures K-12 adult education and community college participation comprehensively and can track students over time. So for 2017, 2018, it's the quarterly reporting into TOPS Pro Enterprise, just as it was in April, and for the end of year of reporting this year. That's for all non-credit students in community college and all K-12 adult education students. And we've been very, very clear, and there have been lots and lots of questions. Neil has forwarded me like 8 different questions where they're saying like, well, you know, it's really hard, and can we just wait for next year when MIS comes online? And it's like, the legislature expects us to really get this done this year. We have to norm the data this year. And they extended basically the data and accountability funding to allow people to offset costs related to the reporting that they're not used to doing, particularly on the community college side downstream. It's for all 7 program areas. In 2018 and 19, the college data will be pulled directly from MIS for data matching and display in the launch board for non-WIOA Title II funded programs. For WIOA Title II, it is still TOPS Pro Enterprise and CASAS pre and post testing. So what we were trying to do is figure out how can we norm the systems to be sure that the colleges are working with the systems that they are used to doing, where we already capture data, and the K-12, who was much more comfortable with TE and the processes there, can actually continue to use those processes as well. We are creating new MIS elements, as Neil identified, to basically capture all the data. There's a bunch of population criteria MIS doesn't capture. There's no pre-apprenticeship flag. There's no high school equivalency flag. I'm not even sure that there's a diploma flag. So there are a number of new elements that are being created. I can tell you absolutely all those elements have been approved for implementation for next year. The plan is to get the detailed guidance out this month to colleges, to researchers. We had a slight kerfuffle 2 weeks ago where a researcher on a statewide listserv basically announced that we weren't meeting any of the deadlines, and it was all falling apart, so everyone in the state thought that nothing was happening. Everything regarding MIS implementation is on track and is getting done. So just kind of to capture some of the system elements, so what we're going to have in 2018-19 is reporting into TE, reporting into MIS, and then there's a whole range of data matching that actually occurs. And there's sort of 2 levels of data matching. There's data matching for WIOA Title II, which has to happen sooner because of the reporting deadlines for WIOA Title II. And then there's data matching for the end-of-year report that will go to the legislature on March 1st. So we'll be matching the K-12 enrollment data with the community college MIS data. We'll be matching to the EDD wage file. We will be expanding and matching to the high school equivalency data, testing data, because colleges, unless they're a testing center, don't capture that data. This is similar to the match that's already done in CDE for the high school equivalency data. Also, the question came up from practitioners about apprenticeship, and so we actually have access to the DAS records, the Division of Apprenticeship Standards, which records enrollment data for all apprentices in the state of California, so we will be able to match to that as well. I don't think we've come to a decision about how to actually sort of show that yet, but we actually have that data. Where we have data available, we're going to try and connect it together in ways that are powerful for consortia. And then Launchboard will be the tool that we use to actually share this data back with the consortia. Who here is not familiar with Launchboard? Anybody? Oh, good. So I'm not going to explain to you what Launchboard is, but we have, West Ed, with Educational Results Partnership, has already built an implementation of an adult education data dashboard that was based on work that was done with two adult ed consortia in the state 2 years ago. Contra Costa was one, and I think Coast was the other one. And so built out a series of metrics and a model for how you could display data that practitioners said they wanted to see. So we're doing a second build out of the Launchboard right now that includes all of the AEBG metrics. And that will be basically, you'll be able to disaggregate that by consortia member. You'll be able to break it up by demographics, by program area. You'll be able to slice and dice your data. There will be a set of kind of preset kind of data that will be displayed, but then you'll have the ability to go into tables and actually do your own exploration of your data. This should prove, hopefully, to be very useful for consortia when, once again, looking at the 3-year plans. The timeline for implementation of the second build of the Launchboard tab is basically winter. So as soon as we get the last year's data from CASAS, which will be on October 20th, we're going to actually proceed with the second tab, with the second build out, and then we'll be able to display that to consortia. What will happen is what always happens. We will share that with consortia. They will tell us all the ways in which that's either not their data or the data doesn't look like the way they want it to look, and then we will start the third build out. But you will have data available to you. We will beta test it. Some of the folks on the college side have been through these processes already. We have found it takes at least 3 builds to begin to get to something that looks like what practitioners actually want to see in the field. It'll be available to all the members of your consortia, so what that means is the adult schools in your consortia will need to get onto, will need to get logons and everything for that, and that'll all be made available to them. This is just another sort of way of illustrating the data flow, into TOPS Pro Enterprise, Chancellor's Office MIS. WIO Title II has its own kind of strand, and so I did this to kind of, because we were having a conversation about data matching on a conference call one day with the Chancellor's Office and CDE, and we get talking about all these different kinds of data matching, and I realized we didn't have anything that sort of showed where and when it happens and what it feeds into. So this was just an attempt to kind of capture that. This is part of the report, the August report. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, can you talk for just another minute about how consortia, you had said that consortia could dig into their own data. Mm-hmm. How will consortia know when certain students fell into the not matched category?
So the Launchboard does not display individual student level data, so you're not going to know which students are or are not matched. We'll be using a fuzzy match, which gets us generally 80+%. And we have done this with both, we've actually done some data testing on that, but it is, when you get into that sort of 80+% in terms of the data match, that does become a representative sample in terms of allowing you to see trends in terms of what's happening in your programs.
So how does the consortia and the consortia members then identify any kind of data quality or data coding problems that they may have that they're interested in improving or making better? How can they figure out where those problems are if they know that they're only going to be looking at roughly 80% of their data?
That's actually a really good question. So I think, and my understanding, and Pat, I'm going to look at you a little bit on this, that neither the data that is reflected back to consortia, both in terms of the tables that CASAS provides or in terms of Launchboard, are based on our aggregations that can be cut up in a variety of ways, but it's not individual student level data. But in terms of, it would be interesting to think, maybe to have that discussion about how we could stand up something for a consortium who wants to understand where their data quality issues are to reflect that back to the consortium. And that would be a project I think would be worth taking on both from CASA's perspective and our perspective. Pat?
I think for WIOA too, that we'll be doing a data match, but we'll also have to, instead of aggregate data, we'll have to have individual student data back. So if you're WIOA 2, you will have individual student data, because we've got to track students out the second quarter and the fourth quarter and get wage information. So those of you that are we owe it to, you will be getting individual student data back.
Yeah, I don't think it's an ability to do it or not do it. I think it's defining a process for reflecting that back to consortia so they can actually make use of the information and trying to figure out what that looks like. And we've mostly been focused, at least heretofore, on trying to get the data in and to get it displayed in ways that folks can actually understand what's going on in their programs. But I think that's what you're raising is a really good second level question in terms of data integrity that we should have for more discussion on. So the adult education data scope and timeline, I think I sort of said this. I will say that it includes 57 different metrics. So it tracks things like transition from K-12 adult or non-credit into credit as well. So there's a lot of other kinds of metrics that came up in terms of the wish list that the consortia originally created that will be there. Fall 17, we're doing the data matching. Will be available this coming winter and spring. We have discussed, and this could be an interesting thing to think about more, Kathy and I have discussed, and we found this helpful on the college side to actually maybe do some regional training with consortia where they actually have their data available to them and actually do some kind of work sessions for using that data for program planning. Because I think one of the things we're hearing very clearly from the field, I know Diana's found this in terms of the feedback to her from consortia, has been folks want to know, how do we use data for program improvement? What does that look like? And what does our consortium process look like for doing that? Because I think when consortia, K-12, and college practitioners can look at data together, it really changes the frame of discussion as opposed, from like, this is my program, that's your program, which I've just been in some conversations like that, to like, these are our students. How do we actually kind of improve these numbers and make them actually be what we would like them to be? So we haven't gone much further with that yet. I will say that we will probably be doing some more expansive kind of discussions of what's in the data at the January convening that's going to move forward. The other activities, Neil talked about the supplemental data report, and this isn't, I want to stress it, at least the way my understanding of it, and this could be right or wrong, is it's not a standardized report. The idea was to have a report where we could go deeper on certain topics every year. So the big topic in the Data and Accountability Committee was, well, we're not tracking for credit students, so what about that? And there are some colleges, there's a number of colleges who have no non-credit programs, who've been doing work on the credit side, but the denominator of students is not exceptionally large. So the question is, maybe we need to do an analysis of where those programs are happening to begin to capture how for credit is being leveraged as a part of the portfolio, and maybe that changes downstream. One of the complicated things about tracking for credit students is like, which students are they? So even if they're students in the Dev Ed Basic Skills sequence at a community college, at what level are they, would they be an adult education student, or how would you actually capture that without getting into some kind of complicated student flagging or something like that? The MIS changes are moving forward, and as Neil identified, we have basically teed up the conversation within the Chancellor's office to look at MIS. It has been made fundamentally clear by non-credit providers that MIS is inherently hostile to adult education students trying to go into a non-credit program. The fact that you ask for a social within the first couple of pages basically means you're probably not serving tens of thousands of students, at least in non-credit, who could otherwise be served by those programs. People like Madeline and Valentina have been very articulate and passionate and have tracked all the ed code and sent it to me in detail to kind of inform this conversation, and there is openness for this. I think there are processes. There's an advisory committee for CCC Applied that is mostly controlled by A&R directors who are inherently conservative in terms of the information they feel like they legally have to capture. So we're actually teeing it up at a higher level with Elias to kind of talk it through, identify both structurally and philosophically, is this the direction we want to go, and to figure out what that looks like. I don't know if that looks like a separate doorway into CCC Apply. I don't know if it looks like a branching structure. We're not that far downstream. But I do think that when we get to that process, well, at least my clear recommendation would be, if we're looking at retooling it, redesigning it, we would want a field team process to look at that in terms of the usability of that for students, because only practitioners really know what works for students in terms of that. So one last thing very quickly. So we identify in the report that there's this part of the legislation that really requires us to basically either issue a menu of a common assessments or to align assessments between the systems. So we had extensive conversations about that. I think, as everybody knows, there are sort of kind of two regimes. There's sort of pre and post testing for measuring educational functioning levels, which CASAS is clearly the experts are, and that rules WIOA Title II. The colleges define student skill levels in terms of the CB21 course rubric for levels below transfer. That's a course flag. It also has a skills rubric attached to it. I will say that we're not the first people to actually think that maybe we should crosswalk these things. There was actually an effort to do that in 2009. CASAS has done crosswalks on this. In the development phase of the Common Assessment Initiative, yes, I'm allowed to use that in a sentence, even though it's on hold. They actually went deeper and looked at also a variety of other standards, including Common Core and Smarter Balance and other assessment instruments in terms of part of that work. So the decision was made to go back and to crosswalk the work again. And this was really the work of the basic skills team. They met twice as part of the data and accountability field process. That's when I say twice, it's 10 hours. So they met twice for 5 hours. They reviewed processes for placement and measuring student progress in K-12 and college, ABE, ASE, and ESL programs. They worked on the outcome and progress metrics for ABE, ASE, and ESL, and they made recommendations regarding the alignment of assessment, primarily to do a crosswalk, a revised crosswalk that includes K-12 adult school instructors, community college faculty, to look at CB21 and NRS to crosswalk the competency level so we know what's happening. When a student reaches, like when they achieve low ASE, what does that mean in terms of CB21? Where does that sit? And those meetings have actually started to happen, and some really fascinating things are actually emerging from those conversations, and practitioners in those meetings were very excited. Lori Howard from CASAS was part of the first 2 meetings, and Jane, who I believe is here as well, was actually at the math meeting last week. So, and we're kind of basically working this out through 3 issues, one of which is this issue of placement. A student shows up, how do you place them? CASAS has kind of, they have placement mechanisms for referring students into courses. Colleges have the placement exam, but are required to use multiple measures and should be looking at things beyond cut scores in the placement exam. How do we measure student progress, whether it's educational functioning levels or course completion along the CB21 ladder? But most important to consortia, I think, are conversations that are already happening regarding student transition. How do you take a student who is in K-12 adult, say ABE or ASE program, has gotten to a certain place, and we think could actually make but really wants to transition to a college program, where do they sit in terms of skills, and what courses should they be taking? And is there a way to think about the kinds of multiple measures work that have been done in traditional K-12 and applying those to adult ed? What would multiple measures look like? So beyond a placement exam, would it be the EFL? Would it be persistence? What other measures for student success would you look at to basically evaluate placement so that maybe they don't have to take the placement exam? Because the levels are very, very clearly defined between the systems. So there are a couple of sort of key elements of the crosswalk as we've kind of laid it out, one of which it is focused on the underlying competencies in the rubrics and not on the testing instruments themselves. And if you align the rubrics and you have testing instruments aligned to NRS or CB21, you're essentially then test agnostic. So any test aligned to the standards that's being used by a local consortia could then be aligned as to the crosswalk itself. In California, clearly that's CASAS, but if there were a local context and you're non-WIOA Title II and you're using TABE or you're using BEST or something like that, you would also be able to kind of use the crosswalk to inform that local discussion. This would be guidance for local placement and multiple measures development between consortia. And for colleges, what it will mean is if you really rigorously apply and use the crosswalks, you will be able to report a measurable skills gain for non-WIOA Title II students, to be very clear, using CB21 course completion. We would be able to pull that directly from MIS. On the colleges, there's been some question about oftentimes the colleges not clearly define which are the ABE and the ASE courses. If we can align to NRS, it'll make it much clearer for colleges in terms of which of their courses in the sequence actually fit that. So all 3 crosswalk groups have met. Those are 4.5-hour meetings. I like saying how long the meetings are because, I don't know, it feels impressive. The college faculty involved in the process were appointed by the State Academic Senate. The K-12 faculty were based on recommendations from CDE, CCAE, and the AEBG office. Faculty are reviewing and editing draft crosswalks already, and they've already identified, originally thought there'd be one big meeting because there's all this crosswalk material and they might get through it rather quickly. They all want to meet again because they think they can go deeper and they can do more. So there's probably going to be follow-up meetings related to that. And the goal is to have initial maps available by the end of the year so that people can use this for the reporting in January. Losing my voice. And that's actually all I got. So, questions? I know I've just did my download. It's like deadly. Okay, so I will be available up in the Tofinelli room for people who have additional questions or want to talk more about the processes or the crosswalks or anything related to that. So, great, thank you.